So welcome everybody. I just wanted to, before we begin, I just want to point out one or two things on the schedule. We're back to meeting almost weekly. We meet today. We're reading the chapter on killing. Next week we'll read the chapter on the Wannsee conference on the 10th. And then there was a mistake in the schedule, and on the 17th we left out the chapter, a very important chapter, chapter 8, duties of a law-abiding citizen. So that will be on the 17th. And then we will meet on the 24th, which was not on the calendar, but there's no reason not to. And we'll read deportations from the Reich and deportations from Western Europe on the 24th. Just wanted to update you on the schedule because there was some confusion around that. Okay, get going in 1 second. All right, so welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and thrilled to be with you today for the virtual reading group. We continue to read Hannah Arendt's most notorious book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, A Report on the Banality of Evil. And we are today reading chapter 6, which is the last of 3 chapters that deal with Eichmann's activities during the entirety of his employment in the Nazi hierarchy and bureaucracy. Right. So the first chapter, chapter 4, dealt with the years 1933 to 1939. And Arendt says, look, let's take seriously what he did and imagine what a defense would have looked like, because he didn't really offer much of a defense. And she does it by breaking his activities up into 3 parts, and these are the 3 chapters, chapters 4, 5, and 6. In chapter 4, from 1933 to 39, she says that there was during these first years and before the war had started, there was in a sense, a kind of detente between some of the more radical Zionists and the Nazis. Now, this doesn't mean that the Zionists are to blame like the Nazis are. That's not her claim at all. But she wants to say that there was enough mutual desire of both the Zionists and the Nazis to bring Jews out of Germany, that Eichmann's job at that time, before the war, was to help expel Jews, and that this was something that he found common cause with many Zionists. And so she says, at this period, he's not an ordinary criminal. He's doing some really awful things, and he's exerting power on Jews, and he's basically helping with an immoral Nazi policy of expelling Jews. But she thinks that there's a systematic mendacity during this period, that while he's certainly doing horrific things, or terrible things, she says doesn't make him in any way a kind of ordinary criminal. This changes, though, in 1939. And so from September 31st, 1939 to June 22nd, 1941, which is the subject of chapter 5 on concentration, he now, is dealing with the fact that he's no longer able to really pursue expulsion, and thus no longer really to make common cause with the Zionists. And his job changes to being one of expelling Jews out of German occupied areas, and he tries to find three different solutions to that problem that we talked about last week. One is of the city of Nisko in the general territory of Poland. The other is Madagascar, and the third is this Camp Theresienstadt. And Arendt is sort of withering about all three, and about how, but basically in this period he ends up becoming more of a criminal, but still not involved with anything like murder or death. Now we reach chapter 6, the final solution, killing. Um, and here is where Eichmann admits his guilt, and where we find out what he actually did that made him one of the greatest criminals in history. And so that's what this chapter is about, is the great criminal Eichmann. But it also raises some different questions. And so the chapter actually takes place in three parts. Part one is Eichmann's confession to his great crimes, right? And so we'll talk about that. Part two is questions of legal mitigation based on the fact that it was that he's convicted of violating a law in Israel that was originally intended for Jewish collaborators. And then part three, I think the most interesting part of the chapter, is on moral questions around Eichmann's conscience and about conscience in general during the Nazi regime. And so we'll get there. The first part, as I said, is Eichmann's confession. And Arendt writes about it for about 9 pages. And all these 9 pages are based primarily on tapes of Eichmann's confession that were played in court, which he gave to Abner Less, the Israeli police interrogator, who interrogated him for weeks when he was first brought to Israel. She says that this phase of his involvement, the killing phase, begins on June 22nd, 1941, with the war on the Soviet Union. 6 to 8 weeks later, it's not clear exactly when, after June 22nd, 1941, Eichmann is summoned to Berlin to meet Heydrich, one of his bosses, and he's told by Heydrich, again in his words, that the Fuhrer has ordered the physical extermination of the Jews. This is on page 83. And on page 84, Eichmann, again in his own words, says, "I now lost everything, all joy in my work, all initiative." The German is Arbeitsfreude. And, here is Eichmann saying, if you credit Eichmann, right? He's saying, for the first 8.5 years that I worked for the Nazis, I liked my work. I was working to expel the Jews and concentrate the Jews, but I felt like what I was doing was important. Now he's told he has to kill Jews, or he has to help kill Jews. And he says, I lost everything, all my joy in my work, all initiative. We can always just have an argument about whether to credit Eichmann on this or not. Arendt thinks he's pretty consistent on it, both in Germany and in Argentina, where he's interviewed by Wilhelm Sassen, and she thinks there's no reason to disbelieve him on this count. She says that he was not the first, but to know about the final solution by a long shot, but he was certainly one of the first of the lower echelon of German Nazi officers. He, along with the rest, now become what's called a Geheimnisträger, a bearer of secrets, right? And we talked about this, I think, earlier in our reading group, where she says that the Nazis changed the Befehlsempfänger, the receiver of orders, first to a Befehlsträger, a bearer of orders, someone who bears responsibility for the orders. And now we also have the Geheimnisträger, the bearer of secrets, not just of orders. And this idea of a burden is going to come back again later in this chapter when she's talking about Himmler and the way that Himmler and Eichmann and others came to deflect questions of conscience because they turned conscience around. Instead of conscience being to do your duty to not commit murder or kill Jews, your conscience became to bear an awful burden and responsibility to kill Jews against your conscience. In the name of a larger war effort. And it's this turning around of the conscience, which to me is the most exciting, the most innovative and intellectually meaningful part of this chapter. She also talks about the way language rules help deflect questions of conscience. The final solution is a language rule that replaces the words killing or liquidation or extermination. In fact, she says on page 85 that the very term language rule was itself a language rule or a code name in that it replaced what we would normally call a lie. That we speak of language rules so that we don't have to speak of lying, right? And she says that on page 86 that, quote, the net effect of this language system was not to keep these people ignorant of what they were doing, but to prevent them from equating it with their old normal knowledge of murder and lies. So these language rules are about not actually, denying what happened or telling or hiding what is happening, but to allow them to have a way of distinguishing what they're doing from lying and murdering. In any case, it didn't work in Eichmann's case, she said, because Eichmann actually was involved in the reality of killing. And this, from a legal point of view, is the core of the case against Eichmann, and it takes place on pages 86 to 90. And she is very detailed about it. So it happens in a number of different cities. The first is in Lublin, where Eichmann goes to visit a brigade commander, Odilio Globochnik, who used Russian submarine engines to push gas into buildings to kill Jews. And on page 87, Eichmann says, for me, this was monstrous. I'm not tough enough to be able to endure something of this sort. But he did. He went there, he saw it, and he reported back to his commanders on it. In Kulm or Kelmno, he saw mobile gas vans, and he says, I hardly looked. I could not. I had had enough. The shrieking. I'm sorry, this can be pretty awful stuff, but Arendt is brutal in her insistence that we actually face what Eichmann did and saw. He talks about a physician who told him to look through a peephole and see what was happening, and he says, I refused to do that. In Minsk, he saw trenches of dead Jews covered in blood. Same in Lvov, where he saw a ditch filled with the blood and the dead. Eichmann talked to the police interrogator, Les, about how he had gone to Lvov mostly because he wanted to see the beautiful train station there done in a style that he liked, but that the head of the Nazi bureaucracy there had insisted on showing him how proud he was of the ditches that he had filled with Jewish blood. And Eichmann said to him, I said, young people are being made into sadists. This is on page 88. Again in Lublin, where he had to go back again, he saw a column of naked Jews led into a hall to be gassed. He says he never watched the gassing, but he was, as Arendt emphasizes, fully informed of how the destruction machinery worked on page 90. And so for Arendt's point of view, and actually in Eichmann's point of view too, the facts are fully clear, and he admits to them all. He admitted that he knew fully about the final solution. He admitted that he participated in it. He admitted that he sent millions of Jews to their death with intent. And he says that he should be hung for it as a warning to others. When the court tries to insist, or when the prosecutor tries to insist that he did things that he doesn't think he did, he says, "Don't you have enough on me?" on page 90. I've already admitted that I've done it. He knew what he was doing. He saw the places. He'd been shocked out of his wits. And Arendt says it's fairly clear he was guilty. And so from her point of view, the case is irrevocable or irrevocable, is clear that he's guilty. She then raises, in what I call part 2 of the chapter, she raises what she calls legal questions of mitigation. She says that the law he was tried under was actually a law originally designed to cover Jewish collaborators with the Nazis, and therefore it had certain ways of mitigating what they had done based on if they had no other choice, or if they tried to do it in a way that was reducing the gravity of the offenses. And she says that in both cases, Eichmann doesn't qualify because, first of all, he didn't do this out of necessity. He could have easily said no, and would not have been killed. And even though once he said I had no choice, I would have been killed. He admits many other times that he could have he could have rejected the jobs he was given, and he didn't. He took them on willingly, and so she says there's no mitigation. She also says that there's no evidence that he had done his best to reduce the gravity of the consequence of the offenses. And so she says, legally, he is fully guilty. All right. So in many ways, that's the end of could have been the end of the chapter. He's admitted to his guilt. He's done these extraordinary crimes, these horrific crimes, and there's no legal defense. But she picks up on a question by the presiding judge, Judge Landau, in which Landau, this is happens first on page 91 and then really on 93 forward, where Judge Landau asks Eichmann not a legal question, but a moral question. Had the killing of the Jews gone against his conscience? And then again, and so Arendt comes back to this on page 93 and says, it's actually worth looking at Eichmann's progression to ask the question of how long it takes an average person to overcome his innate repugnance toward crime. And so she's interested in the question of how Eichmann's conscience turned around. And she says that we can get a pretty good insight into this by looking at the first 4 weeks after Eichmann's meeting with Heydrich. In those first 4 weeks, in the first week, Eichmann was ordered to transfer 20,000 Jews and 5,000 gypsies for the final solution. And he was ordered to send them to Minsk and Riga to be killed. But for somehow, and he found that there was a certain there was an option. He could also send them to a place called Lodz. And in Lodz, they did not have killing facilities yet, but they just had labor camps. And Eichmann, in a sense, he didn't violate his orders because he found a way to make it consistent with his orders. But as he said when he was confronted with the documents, he made a choice to send them to Lodz instead of Riga and Minsk, where they would not be killed. He got into trouble for this and he was reprimanded. And it was something he didn't feel very proud of, it seems. And yet, RN says that in this first week, it seems like there was at least some element of conscientiousness or conscious activity in Eichmann's behavior. This doesn't mean that he tried to save Jews when he could. He didn't. This was the last time. And it doesn't mean that he was the person who always, made the decision to send Jews to their death. He didn't. He didn't have that authority. But she says this was the one instance and the only instance where he availed himself of a choice to try and save some Jews and some gypsies. 3 weeks later, he agreed to send 50,000 Jews to their death in Riga and Minsk. And she says, here we have an answer to Judge Landau's question. Quote on page 95, yes, Eichmann had a conscience, and his conscience functioned in the expected way for about 4 weeks, whereupon it began to function the other way around. Even when Eichmann had a conscience, it was limited, right? She says his conscience seemed to care more about German Jews than the fact that Jews were murdered. But the point is that after 4 weeks, he came to see his conscience as bearing this burden, right? The Befehlsträger instead of the Befehlsempfänger, to bear the burden of having to do things he didn't want to do. And so his conscience actually became that it was his duty, his conscientious duty to do his job, even if it was hard and even if it was unwelcome. And this is what she means by the turning around of conscience. She then looks at how this turning around of conscience, or how this question of conscience can be seen throughout Germany, not just in Eichmann. And so on page 97, she starts to think about the resistance to Hitler, and especially the conspiracy of July 20th, 1944, in which a number of leading Nazis and some former Nazis and some current Nazis had a plan to assassinate Hitler and take over. These resistance cells, she says, very, very rarely mentioned Jews or the massacres in the East. And most of them were former Nazis and some were current Nazis. Their leader was Karl Friedrich Godler, who served 3 years as the Nazi price controller, but resigned in 1936, so fairly early, long before the war, and even before Kristallnacht. And these conspirators, these anti-Hitler conspirators, were focused on the fact that the rule of law was being trampled. They wanted a constitutional monarchy. They saw Hitler as a swindler, a dilettante, a madman, and a demon. But they weren't morally opposed to what he was doing. As so much as they thought he was ineffective and hurting Germany and would make it harder for especially if Germany lost, to recover. So they weren't inspired by moral indignation, she writes on page 100, but by the conviction that Hitler was nuts and would lose. She cites a bitter judgment against these men by the German novelist Friedrich P. Reck Malitzwuen on page I think 100. It's going to be 102, in which he writes, "A little late, gentlemen, you who made this arch destroyer of Germany and ran after him as long as everything seemed to be going well. You who without hesitation swore every oath demanded of you and reduced yourselves to the despicable flunkies of this criminal who was guilty of the murder of hundreds of thousands, burned with the lamentations and the curse of the whole world." Right? So, the point is that these resistors, again, she doesn't think of as conscientious resistors. She thinks of them as people who were strategic and thought that when Hitler was going well and Germany was going well, they went with him. But when things started to go bad, they said, "Oh, this guy's crazy, and we should save Germany from him," but not because they were moved by conscience. And on 103, there's this chilling line where she says, "From the accumulated evidence, one can only conclude that conscience as such had apparently got lost in Germany." She does talk in a few places about the few people who did have a conscience, right? And she'll talk more about this later in the book as well, in the last few chapters. And it's an important part of her account that there were people who did have a conscience. They were mostly, she says, isolated individuals. This is on page 99, who were completely aware of the national and the moral catastrophe. No one knows how many of them there were, she says on 103, but they came from all strata of society. Some were famous, like the novelist Rek Maleksulian and Karl Jaspers, her teacher, but most, she says, were unknown. There were a few who refused oaths, Nazi oaths, and were killed. So she talks about two peasants described in Gunther Weisenborn's Der lautlose Aufstand, the silent resistance from 1953, who refused to take an oath and were hung. And in their final letter back to their parents, they said, "We too would rather die than burden our conscience with such terrible things." For those interested in such a in the idea of conscience, I can't recommend highly enough Terrence Malick's movie, A Hidden Life. I mean, every Terrence Malick movie is a brilliant movie, but A Hidden Life is one of my all-time favorites, in which he depicts the life of Franz Jägerstätter, an Austrian peasant, again, who was a conscientious objector and was put to death at the age of 36. It's a brilliant movie and highly recommended if you haven't seen it. The point is that these few people who did resist out of conscience, she says of them, that their ability to tell right from wrong remained intact, which she doesn't think is the case for most of the other resistors, and certainly not for people like Eichmann. The one exception of people who actually not only had a conscience but acted. I mean, so like the peasants and who refused to sign the oath, they had a conscience, but they didn't act. They didn't resist. The resistors didn't have a conscience. But the one exception, and again, I don't know if it's the only one exception, but the one exception she mentions here are the Geschwister Scholl, the siblings, the brother and sister, Hans and Sophie Scholl, who in Munich were part of the White Rose resistance movement, which was a student group, and were killed for handing out leaflets calling Hitler a mass murderer. She then talks about Heinrich Himmler, who's another interesting case, because even though Himmler was high up and deeply involved in the final solution, it was Himmler more than anyone else who developed these catchphrases that she calls phrases that deflect the conscience on page 105 to 106. Phrases like, "My honor is my loyalty," and "a great task that occurs once in 2,000 years," and "what horrible things I had to watch in the pursuance of my duties, how heavily the task weighed upon my shoulders," right? These were tasks that were designed to turn conscience around. And by the way, another great movie, if you haven't seen it, is Der Anständige, or the Der Anständige, the upright one, the decent one is what it's called in English, which is a movie done by that is based on Himmler's diaries, which were found after the war, actually found about 20 years ago, quite recently. And in these diaries, and there is no word spoken in the movie, Dan Ständiger, that is not from Hitler's diaries, Himmler's diaries. And in it, he keeps calling himself the decent one, der Anständige, and tries to maintain this fiction of himself as a decent one. And Arendt is here talking about how these ideas of, how I had to bear the burden of doing horrible things, and that this is my conscientious duty, um, is part of this Himmler strategy for this. And she says that Eichmann himself focused on the question of war. He saw dead people everywhere. He saw killing, and he said, that in a sense made it easier to kill. Um, the final part of this chapter is on mercy killings, namely the idea that the final solution and the language rules of it came out of not the RSHA, the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, where Eichmann and Müller and others and Heydrich were working, or even Himmler, but out of the Hitler's chancellery and out of another division, and that it was emerged out of as a continuation of the euthanasia program that was first developed to euthanize sick, elderly, insane, and others who were a drain on the German economy and the German culture, and that this was the sort of another foundation of how conscience was deflected by turning to medical euthanasia like terminology. In any case, the chapter as a whole, right, is about Eichmann's guilt as a killer, and then the question of how the entire German apparatus and life and culture under the Nazis made it possible for conscience to turn itself around in this way. Okay, I'm going to stop there and see what you guys have to say about this chapter. Again, you can raise your hand down with the reactions button at the bottom of your screen. You can also engage in the chat. Please do be respectful of others, and you are certainly welcome to disagree, and but please don't insult each other personally. We'll start there. Jerry, I see you're joining us and you have your hand up, so welcome. You have to unmute yourself, Jerry.
Is that better?
That is better.
Okay. This better business about conscience. I'd like to hear a bit more from you about it, because, I mean, you have shown beautifully how it changes. But what is it that changes? What is the conscience? This will become extremely important, it seems to me, in the title of the book. The banality of evil is a lack of thoughtfulness, as I understand it. And the root of conscience, linguistically, but also phenomenologically, for Arendt, is thinking. So, I mean, I don't think the upshot, regardless of what she says with a great deal of irony here, that conscience changes. I don't think that's right. I don't think it's what she means. It means that there is no conscience. It's not a changed conscience. I don't believe, that one thinks at one point and then doesn't think at another point. If you see what I mean, Roger, that's...
I do see what you mean, Jerry, and it's a fascinating question. Um, and so, you know, let me see if I can say something intelligent about it because it's a great question. You ask, does Eichmann's conscience change? I think the word she uses and I used is turn around, or does it disappear? Um, uh, and um, you know, so let me just try and think this through because it's you know, if thinking, as you said, and thinking with and conscience is a kind of thinking with, is to think from the perspective of others, to put yourself in their place and think what they think. Um, you know, uh, you would have to put yourself in the position of the Jews and the Gypsies and think that, and it would be hard to justify sending them to their deaths for no reason. Um, what she's, I think, suggesting, or at least with irony or not, and we have to evaluate it as you've asked, is when this conscience turns around and the conscience becomes not to think from the perspective of the Jews and the Gypsies and from the world and, outside of Germany, outside of Nazis, but to think, to do one's duty to either your superiors or to the war effort, right? I actually don't think it's to one's superiors, but I think, and this is what she's saying about Eichmann and war, and this is what he says in his interview with Sasson in Argentina, is that he was at war and he understood that it was his duty to sacrifice his normal conscience to do his duty to the war effort. Is that conscience? Is that a kind of thinking? As I take it to be the question you're asking, um, or is that unthinking, simple obedience that is of the worst kind? And I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I'll be honest. I mean, one could argue that it's that to sort of repress your moral repugnance, your conscientious repugnance, your thoughtful repugnance in the name of a war effort could either be to stop thinking and just do your duty, or it could be a kind of uh, uh, you know thoughtful decision that, as difficult as it is, one has to see from the perspective of the war effort. And in a war, you have to do bad things. Um, uh, you know, Obviously, if he's banal and thoughtless, it makes it seem hard to believe that that's a thoughtful decision. But I think what she's saying is, whether it's thoughtful or not, um, somehow he came to see it as a duty to bear this responsibility, and that the Nazis pushed him in that direction with this idea of calling it the Befehlsträger, and the bearer of responsibilities and orders, and the Geheimnisträger, the bearer of secrets, and also Himmler's idea of, that this is a task thrown onto you that comes rarely, every 2,000 years, right, or so. Um, uh, you know, um, I'm trying to decide if I think it's an important, if it's important, whether we say that he has his conscience has turned around or he has no conscience. Um, I'm not, and I don't know what I think on that, Jerry. I think that the general argument I understand, right, which is that his conscience turned around. Does that mean his conscience turned off, or does it mean it turned around? I'm sort of at a loss. I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, maybe one answer is to say, does it matter? And I'm sure it does, but I'm sort of suggesting that maybe it's not as important as the fact that it happened. I don't know. Jerry, what do you think?
I think you I think you did a lot to enlighten me, and I thank you.
Well, you've done a lot to enlighten me, Jerry, so I thank you. John, you're up next.
Thanks, Roger.
John?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Uh, all right. The thing that disturbs me very highly is the notion that conscience as such got lost in Germany, not just uh, with our friend, but the whole culture. And it seems to go back to this culture of mendacity that started um, with the kind of stab in the back theory of Ludendorff after World War One. That was the big lie. That it was the big lie, and that set the stage for an entire culture of mendacity rooted in their loss in World War One. Anyway, um, my question is this euthanasia program that started very early on in the Nazi period. And the question is, how is that related to the eugenics movement that was broadly established in the early part of this century outside Germany as well as inside Germany? This notion that inferior people or sick people or malformed people, people with birth defects and so on, should be eliminated to create uh, a master race.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, John. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that the in the 1920s and well, 19 teens to 20s and even into the 30s in the US, the eugenics movement was actually part of a central plank of the progressive platform. I mean, we shouldn't forget that. The Progressive Party and the progressive movement um was the main proponent of eugenics. It was thought that it would improve the bloodlines of society and improve the economy and improve and require less welfare and less suffering. Um, and in that famous case, what was it? Buck John Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. and I think it's Buck. I think was the main name, but I forget it. Buck versus
I
whom?
think you're right. It was in Virginia. Buck.
Buck and uh Holmes upholds the Virginia eugenics law, saying what 3 generations of morons is enough. Um, and he's one of the more famous progressive judges. Uh, so it was a profound belief amongst many at the time that eugenics and euthanasia and killing off the sick and the insane was a merciful way of helping them and improving society. To the credit of the progressives, um, after the 1940s, they abandoned this program largely, I think, because of the similarities to the final solution and the way that it so easily um was was transferred to the final solution. And we've largely, thankfully, avoided further progressive arguments for eugenics and euthanasia. But that is a sad a part of the history of the early 20th century and the rise of progressive thinking. So I think it's an important point to make. So thank you. Miriam? Yeah.
Hi, this is a historical question, so I could do the research, Roger, but you might have a point of view. My question has to do with the instrumentalization of Jewish populations for industry. And that, I mean, mostly we hear, you know, this book is about military, right? But I understand that Jewish labor was used for companies like Porsche, Mercedes, car manufacturers, or I'm sure they were making military equipment at that time. And I am rather curious about the connection between the military, between people like Eichmann and that branch of the program of extermination. I wonder if you know about that.
I'm certainly not an expert on it. I mean, on page 79, in the chapter we read for last week, she talks about IG Farben, the
Hmm.
Kruppwerke, the Siemens Schukertwerke, all had established plants in Auschwitz as well as near the Lublin death camps. And she says cooperation between the SS and the businessmen was excellent.
Yeah.
Rudolf Haas of Auschwitz testified to the very cordial social relations with the IG Farben representatives. And as for working conditions, the idea was clearly to kill through labor. According to Hilberg, at least 25,000 of the approximately 35,000 Jews who worked for one of the IG Farben plants died. So, go ahead, Miriam.
No, just to kill through work. I was wondering if, yeah, I've heard about that, about that work that was designed to kill. But I was also wondering about those industrialists and what happened to them after the war, if any of them ever went to trial or not.
Well,
Or did they get a pass?
what's the famous one who, the famous one who worked for Hitler who was put on trial, and then was not killed, was put in prison and then released.
Wasn't it Krupp? Krupp was one.
Starts with an, I don't know if Krupp tried and released, and jailed and released,
I don't know. He
but
just name comes up.
what's the guy's name? It begins with an S. The last name begins with an S, but I'm blanking on his name. I'm sorry.
The time with conscience to me is that if you're going to work somebody to death, it takes time. You know, you have to see them. You have to see them in your factory. You have to hurt them in, to hurt them out. It's like it's in your face. It's not like it's not like a one-off. You hurt them into
This is Heidi.
gas them, you know.
Hold on, excuse me 1 second. Heidi, could you mute yourself while you're, or I'll mute you. Oh yeah. Yeah. Go ahead, Miriam.
Yeah, it was just I just made my point. I mean it takes a while. Like Eichmann said he had to look away, you know, when Jewish people were being gassed. And I'm thinking about industrialists that did not look away, but saw them day after day until they died. That's
I'm sure the head industrialist didn't go and hang out with the slave laborers on their floors. But you're right, and I don't. I know that some of these corporations did eventually pay reparations to funds to help, Jewish groups, but it took a long time. I don't think it happened right away. And by the way, some of these foundations did eventually, I mean, corporations did eventually create foundations that have supported Jewish causes, but I'm talking like 40 or 50 years later. That's an important.
I just wanted
as well.
to try to think about that, you know, the relationship between the military and the industrialists and I would think it in a sense, to me, it's almost it's almost worse. The military could say to themselves, we're in a war, this is awful stuff, it has to happen. I don't know what. I don't know what the head of Porsche would say to himself. Really, I don't.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean it's a good question. And obviously it's somewhat beyond the, I mean,
Yes, beyond the scope, I understand, but I just
not, but it's not. I mean, it's, it's part of the general um culture where conscience as such got lost. And I think it's an important distinction. I mean, a lot of what she's describing here, I don't, you can't but think about certain current politics in the United States, and the way that um individual people who know better and know that someone like Donald Trump is a demon and mad and dangerous. Um, Somehow, as long as they think they can control him and prevent the worst from happening, are happy to um work with him. And let's just pray that they don't have to at some point decide when to form a resistance. Um, uh, in that sense. But it is, I think it's hard to read this section on the resistance and not think about, certain figures, respectable figures, some of them within the Republican Party who have um uh who are making the same kind of bargain that some of them made. Again, I don't want to say that it's the same, because I don't think Donald Trump is Adolf Hitler. Uh, and I don't think he has an extermination program in a book he's written called Mein Kampf or anything like that. So I don't want to say it's the same, but uh, it there's certainly um, uh, some similarities that one should at least be aware of and think about.
thank you.
Yep. Bella.
Yeah, hello. I was amazed in this chapter with Hannah Arendt literary style. She's a good dramatist. And I have a note about how language of authoritarians affects human morality, leading all of the structure to the crime. On my opinion, Hannah Arendt responds to the order to be superhumanly inhuman by her sarcastic point of view on Eichmann personality as a doubly disembodied voice. Sounds like she passed judgment on all the Nazi structure as I can see it. But eventually she enhances this horror with the other scene where German woman doubts on Führer permission, but believe that he able to gas all Germans, as I understood. This is mostly shocking, cathartic moment for me, and because in totalitarian regimes, people's judgments is a very horrible thing. I can tell that in Russia, for example, today's Russia, current Russia, authoritarians use not only settings but obstructive law language and awful language such as Mercedes in Nazi Germany. But yeah, and I saw some court sentences, and they can say these sentences is inconsistent and illogical. Just a note.
Yeah. So thank you very much. Oh, go ahead.
No, that's it. Thank you.
Yes, you bring up an important question of style and of sarcasm and irony. Um, and the way if I understood you correctly, the way even today some of this is being used in certain totalitarian contexts. I mean,
Absolutely.
the last story you told, which I didn't talk about and is worth at least paying attention to because I think it is chilling, is on 110 to 111, the last pages of the chapter. And she's telling two stories um about the way these language of euthanasia was used to, in a sense, deflect conscience. And she tells the story that happened in Königsberg, Kant's old city in East Prussia, which is now a part of the Soviet Union or Russia. In which a few days before the Russians destroyed the city, um, uh, a woman, a doctor came to help treat people, and a woman came to him and showed him varicose veins that she had for years, but wanted to have treated now because she had time, right? So you're in the midst of this war. This woman comes to the doctor and says, "Can you treat my varicose veins?" And he says, "I try to explain that it is more important for her to get away from Königsberg and to leave the treatment for some later time." And she says, well, that's not so important because the Russians will never get us. The Fuhrer will never permit it. Much sooner, he will gas us. And she says that this is actually part of the language of the time in which Hitler and others had said, "Don't worry, if worse comes to worse, I'll gas the whole German population and kill you mercifully so you don't have to lose." And this doctor looks around furtively, and no one found this statement out of the ordinary. Now that's, I think, a non-ironic part of the story. And it really just highlights the way this kind of language deflects conscience. But Arendt adds one of the most bitter and biting codas to this when she ends the chapter thusly: "The story, one feels, like most true stories, is incomplete." That's an interesting point. Why most true stories are incomplete. Just think about that. "There should have been one more voice, presumably or preferably a female one, which, sighing heavily, replied, 'And now all that good, expensive gas has been wasted on the Jews.'" I'll just leave it there because I don't think you can get much more ironically biting and bitter than that. Not what else to say. So I'll stop. Ken.
Hopefully this follows what you're talking about. I'm wondering if we can talk a little more about how she wrote this book and the structure of it. I mean, in some ways it's similar to a lot of her books, like that she's writing to understand as opposed to writing to explain something that she already understood. But she puts us in such a difficult position, and herself, in this book. It interests me that, as far as I know, this is the only book she didn't write an introduction for or a preface. And the effect of that is that we're thrown into the court, in the first sentence, "Welcome to the House of Justice," or whatever it is. And then we're facing Eichmann himself. And I would go so far as to say that the way that she's writing this book, and a lot of her books, if we talk about her having an argument, but if you want to read an argument into it, you have to start from the end of the book and read to the beginning. And she wrote an epilogue to this book and not a preface, not an introduction. So she wanted us to be there, like in this uncomfortable place, like really facing him. And it feels like it's been interesting to me listening to the group because we want to condemn him, and I know for myself, like when I walk into a room with a Trump supporter at this moment, I don't really want to hear from them. I want to hear how dumb they are. I want to condemn them. And she doesn't even do that with Eichmann. She walks in and the question is really like, who is this guy? And we have to face him. And then I would say, more than an argument, the entire book up to this point has been descriptive. like not her saying, this guy should die and here's why, but saying like, these are the conditions, this is who he is, this is the courtroom, this is where we are, these are the laws. And I think that that puts us into the mix in a way that's extremely painful, and one that we don't really want to be in for the most part. We want to sort of jump to the end. And I noticed you have to do that a lot in the discussions. You have to say, yeah, she believes he should die, but she has not said that yet. Maybe up to this chapter, she might have said, the facts were already intact earlier. And in this chapter, she says, yeah, there's the verdict is out. But it's not really an argument either. That's stating the facts again. And so what we're forced to do, I think, is really face him. She's not like presenting an argument and counter arguments that we can follow. And it feels a little out of place when people are arguing with her, because I don't really feel like she's arguing. I feel like she's describing. And I think also that plays into this conversation about conscience. Like, I don't know if she thinks it disappears or not, but reality certainly has a place in it. And this turning upside down of reality in order to turn upside down conscience and consciousness seems really relevant. Like she's making us face up. And part of what she's doing and the things that make her angry is standing in Eichmann's shoes too. Like, how would I defend myself if I was in that position? How would I defend him if I was his defense attorney? I don't think she's sympathetic. And I don't think she's also equating the Jewish leaders with Nazis. I think she's just saying these things exist at this point. The Jewish leaders exist, the Nazis exist, and we're left to speculate about it. At the end of the book, she did write an epilogue, and she says, I only talk about the banality of evil in a factual way. And the book is so much facts. Anyway, just that stress on factuality, the lack of an introduction, the way she throws us into it, and then we're still in it, sort of like following our way around and negotiating the facts, I think is really intentional. I think that's really part of the banality of it is the way it's written.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Ken. I mean, I think you've hit upon something that she would say thank you to. She wrote what she called a report on the banality of evil. In the afterward, so she wrote an epilogue. She also wrote an afterword responding to many of her critics, and in the postscript, and in that postscript, she, says over and over again, look, this is a factual book. Until the epilogue, she says, I didn't make an argument. I was a journalist. She wrote this book originally as a journalist for the New Yorker. And she's like, there's no argument. It's a report. It's facts. And you're right that, she says in the first chapter, in some sense, the facts were not in dispute. We all knew he was guilty. And then she says it again in this chapter here. He's admitted his guilt. He's guilty and he should be killed. So, she does say that in both the first chapter and here in the sixth chapter, but she hasn't made an argument yet. And she really doesn't. And, one reason the book has been controversial is I think it's precisely the reason you said and brought up, which is that people wanted moral condemnation. They wanted an argument. They wanted that. And she's holding herself back from that, trying to present the facts, the trial, Eichmann, and all of that. There's, I think you're absolutely right that this is not done out of sympathy with Eichmann. It's done out of a desire to understand, and to think and understand how Eichmann and some people like him could do what he did and how the Holocaust could happen. That's where she's coming from. So I think you're absolutely right into pointing that out. And there will be, now we should at least say that there are places in the book where it doesn't seem purely factual, right? So on the question of like Jerry asked at the beginning about the conscience, did it turn around or did it disappear? I mean, that's not simply a factual question. She's actually, I think making an argument, but that's an argument that, there's lots of little arguments like that within the book that are not an argument about Eichmann himself, but more arguments about conscience or about collaboration and things like that. And those will come up. And so there are parts that maybe are not pure factual, but overall, she is, while she knows the judgment and she's not hiding the fact that she knows the judgment, she is trying to understand. And I think that's how the book is written. So it's an important point.
I would only say, even in those places, that there's some subjective description. And even there, I don't really see an argument about conscience. When I think about that, I think about her writing about thinking much later, her last book. But here, it doesn't seem like an argument so much as there are subjective points of view, but it didn't seem really argued to me. But that's semantic.
Yeah, thank you. Vigdis.
Yes, I want to point to something. I think it also relates to some of the other things that have been brought up, and that is, it's in my book, page 95, so I guess it's 97 in the one you have. I have this edition, which probably is a later Penguin edition, and it's where it's Harry Mulisch relates how, in connection with the testimony given by Professor Salo W. Barron about the cultural and spiritual achievements of the Jewish people, the following questions suddenly occur to him. And that's, would the death of the Jews have been less of an evil if they were a people without a culture, such as the Gypsies, who were also exterminated? And is Eichmann on trial as a destroyer of human beings or as an annihilator of culture? And is a murderer of human beings more guilty when the culture is also destroyed in the process? And when he put this question to the Attorney General, it turned out Hausner thinks yes, I think no. And then she go on to describe the film Dr. Strangelove, and where she ends with saying, and who are to be the happy survivors? And those with the highest IQ, she said, with an exclamation mark, she writes. And that led me actually to question, and I think that is relevant for much of this. She has this distinction between the darkness of the heart and reason. And I think the darkness of the heart, it's where much of our prejudices are. We find them in this darkness. And I wonder if you think that that might also be linked to the possible relationship sets between thinking and conscience, if conscience should be a reliable source for making moral judgments. Because that is, in a way, we have prejudices, and I suppose if we are honest, we have prejudices against different people that we might need reason to reflect to make some judgment.
Vigdis, are you asking me whether conscience is a realm of prejudice?
No, I think conscience is thinking is needed if you should develop a conscience that is to be relied upon to make moral judgment. I think that when she makes the distinction between the darkness of her heart and reason, I think that goes with, in the darkness of our heart, we have prejudices. There are things we think that should not be made out public and that we have to think about, and that we have kind of to think through to make some judgments.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. This goes to Jerry's question in some sense of, is conscience, can conscience be turned around to be the conscience to bear this burden of the lack of conscience of being a war hero or of doing horrible things in war, as a necessary part of the victory of a side you believe in. And can that be a kind of thoughtful, rational view, or is that ultimately founded in prejudice? And I remain unsure of how to answer that, as I was when Jerry asked the question. Which probably means it's a really good question, and I should probably think more about it, but I'm not sure I know how to do that right now. I just have to.
I can just end with saying that my mentor, when I was writing my master thesis, always said that conscience is not a reliable source for moral judgment. And I think I agree if you just take your conscience from where it starts. So, because I think upbringing, and I think also religious belief and things like that is kind of have something to say for how your conscience is working. That's just my.
But then you are reducing conscience to prejudice in some way, and then of course it's not a reliable moral judgment. But what's interesting is in the question that you and Jerry have asked is, insofar as conscience actually turns around and becomes a thoughtful standard for bearing the responsibility of what normally would be evil deeds in the name of a higher good in a war effort, then conscience is not simply a prejudice. Is it a thoughtful, rational defense of evil in certain circumstances? And that's the harder question. So and I think that Jerry's reluctance to call that conscience and to say it's the destruction of conscience makes sense to me. And yet, I'm not sure on how to draw that line or how to make that case, which is why I think Arendt doesn't say that and says instead the conscience gets turned around. Whether that's ironic or whether it's not, I don't know the answer. I think it's one of those very difficult questions. That is the kind of question which.
Yeah, thank you. I agree on that.
Yes, Harold.
Thank you, Roger. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. Going back to something previous, I think it's important. I have a talk that's called Auschwitz, Evil and the Industrialization of Death. And I just wanted to give a little quote from that, which is relevant to what people have been talking about. And this I got from Andrew Linnell. By the late 1920s, American eugenicists produced dramatic literature promoting eugenics and sterilization. This spread to other countries, especially to German scientists and medical professionals. Soon, California led the world in forced sterilization. The forced sterilization, and this is key, the forced sterilization program engineered by the Nazis was inspired by California's. Key to funding this movement was the Rockefeller Foundation, who helped develop German eugenics programs. California eugenics leader, and I think this is kind of ironic, his name was C.M. Goethe, wrote to a colleague, "You will be interested to know that your work has played a powerful part in shaping the opinions of the group of intellectuals who are behind Hitler in this epic-making program. Everywhere, I sense that their opinions have been tremendously stimulated by American thought. I want you, my dear friend, to carry this thought with you for the rest of your life, that you have really jolted into action a great government of 60 million people, referring to Germany. That's all I had to say.
Oh, yeah, well, thank you, Harold. It's a powerful statement, and I think it's something, I mean, I think we should be aware that Germany was inspired by a number of things in the United States. First of all, by slavery and Jim Crow, and secondly, by the eugenics movement here. And it's helpful to know. I didn't realize that line of transmission on the eugenics movement was so clear, but that's chilling. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. Marie. Marie, are you there? All right, Dina.
Hi, I have a question to sort of follow up on our conversation about conscience, and that is, in what ways does Arendt's notion of conscience differ from her notion of principles, and in what ways are they, what do they share? And in terms of principles, what I'm referring to is what Arendt, discusses reading Montesquieu and alongside Kant and others, where she says in other works, not in Eichmann and Jerusalem, that principles have an organizing element in political action, and in revolution, for example, principles have a guiding power of sorts that arise through the performance of a political act. That a principle is necessary in order to not just engage in endless self-defeating pursuits of absolute new beginnings. So principles are there to sort of guide us in our political action. And in what way does conscience mirror that, and in what ways conscience different from a political principle?
Yeah, you guys are asking hard questions today. So I don't think principles are the same thing as conscience, all right? Principles are not thinking. Principles are sort of the distilled core idea of a people, whether it's equality or honor or different, what sort of is the core idea. So freedom, liberty, and whatever. And those principles help us understand and think through, specific laws and specific crises. Conscience is different. It's a kind of thinking, and it's like that daemon, the demon that appears on Socrates' shoulder when he has a difficult moral decision to make, and reminds him. Now, does it remind him of principles? That in a way, this comes back to the same question: is conscience context specific, or is it universal? Right? In a sense, that's the question Jerry asked. I hadn't thought of it that way, but now I do. Is conscience a universal claim about the wrongness of murder, or is conscience about being a good citizen within a state, whether that state is a good state or a bad state? It's the old question of Aristotle asks in his Politics about the difference between a good citizen and a good person, right? A good person has to be good regardless of the state they're in, the polis they're in, whereas a good citizen is only good context specific, depending whether they follow the principles and of the state they're in. And so in some ways, I'm trying to decide if I want to say this or not, but throw caution to the wind. one can say that in the turnaround of Eichmann's conscience that Arendt is describing, you see the move from being a good person to being a good citizen. In that he is being consistent with the demands of the Nazi constitution. And that his conscience is becoming geared towards the principles of the Nazi state as opposed to a moral conscience.
And when
That's
you engage in civil disobedience or protest, does that involve the good citizen versus good person dichotomy, or does it involve, or is it based on whatever political principle we value?
well, I mean, in that particular essay, she's talking about the civil rights movement. And what she says is that the civil disobedience and the anti-war movement were both good persons and good citizens because A, they were motivated by a moral universalism, and B, they found within the resources of the United States ways of imagining the country to be moral, even in spite of its immoral laws, and that they appeal to higher laws, the Constitution and the ideals of the country, the principles of the country, rather than the reality of Jim Crow and the murders in Vietnam and Cambodia. So that's how I would understand that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Joanne?
Yeah, I also want to talk about conscience a little bit. I think maybe we are making it so entirely mental and spiritual and even psychological, but maybe shouldn't use that word. But I think my point is we need to think about it also as somehow connected to our bodies. So if we believe, which I certainly do, that we are lived bodies, and of course that's Merleau-Ponty's phrase, their conscience is something that our bodies do, as well as some kind of calculation. Or, I mean, it's not a separate calculation, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It's not simply a rational calculation. In the pages, I think it starts on page 87 through 89, the testimony that Eichmann gives, that she reports about what he was seeing and how he was repulsed. That is an extremely horrible description. It repulses me 80 some years after she wrote it, just to read it again. I've read it before, but so I just want to kind of make a plug for the bodily aspect of this. But again, considering that the body is not some machine or something separate from all the rest of what we've been talking about. So I think that if we're to believe that what Eichmann said, that he couldn't watch that, he was so upset about it. Well, not only did his, quote, conscience change in a kind of rational way, if you will, but I think his body must have changed also. He must, in other words, he must have changed as a fully lived being, somebody in the world who could not stand to see that and later can stand to see it and becomes part of it.
Yeah. Joanne, I think that's
I just want to add one thing is the average German, I think, is something totally separate
from the people who are doing the actual murders and being responsible the way Eichmann was.
Thank you. I think it's a really good point, and you know, the you know, one of the things that Arendt points to, and if you watch movies in which you see the real Eichmann at the trial, you can see it in his body, just and in his language, the phrases, the cliches, the way he moved, the very bureaucratic kind of ordered way. When that came about, who knows, right? I mean, we don't know. We don't have video of him prior to that. But the obviously regimented language and movement of his body and his speech, I think is part of the internalization of that way of thinking that you're talking about. I think you're absolutely right. I'm sorry, I can't see it actually. Is it Zhao?
Yes, João.
Joao. Nice to
John.
John.
You
I'll
you
try.
can
Joao.
John in English.
I'll try
Okay.
my best, Joao.
Okay,
Thank you.
nice to meet you. Thank you
Nice
very
to meet
much
you.
for your talk. Well, I have a simple question because Eichmann, during the process, he always denies his guilty upon deaths. But he was the responsible for the transport of not only Jews, but everybody that was being carried to the camps. As he did a bad job, a great proportion of people died during the transport. My question is, was he somehow accused for these deaths during the transport? During the transport in the trains.
People who died during the transport?
Yes, because his responsibility was for the transport of everybody, not only Jews. And a huge parcel of these people they died during the trips.
It's a nice point, Joao. And I don't know the answer to it. I mean, it's not really mentioned in the trial, as far as I know, and it's not mentioned in the report that Arendt writes. You know, I mean, part of his job was to find out what the capacity in the camps were and the trains were, and you know, to try and you know, fit the right number of people
the logistics.
On the train. The logistics, and you're right that to the extent he overburdened the trains with too many people, he could be potentially responsible for that. It's not something that in my memory ever came up anywhere at the trial or in the book. So it's a good thought. And, you know, it would be, if you were the lawyer prosecuting him, it'd be another way to approach it. I don't know if you're a lawyer, Joao, but
that's my
are
point.
you? Yeah, there you go. You're a lawyer. You know, I recognize the legal reasoning. So yes. Martin, we have 1 minute. So if you can do it quickly, I'll just give you the last word. You got to unmute yourself though, Martin, quickly.
Okay now?
Yeah.
Okay. After our discussion last time about Raoul Hilberg and the citations, I looked in the index of our book, and I found that there were 10 citations to him in the book. So I kind of guessed that there might be a similar number of uses in the New Yorker articles. But one citation struck me, and that's on page 282 in the postscript, where she says, the book appeared after the trial and constitutes the most exhaustive and the most soundly documented account of the Third Reich's Jewish policies. the use of the word appeared struck me. That it seems like she's saying it just came out of nowhere and she didn't know about it beforehand. And it kind of raises the question as to why she uses that word, why this appears in the postscript, and whether it constitutes something of a disassociation with her failure to put in the citations in the original articles, or a way of skipping over. I'm not quite sure. I'd like your thoughts on that. But I also have this other question, and since I only have a minute, I'll put the two together. Are there any other examples in which it appears that she failed to give appropriate credits?
So I don't know of any other examples of that, but maybe there are. Yeah, and I didn't want to say that she did fail. I don't know. The New Yorker doesn't do citations, right? I mean, they don't have footnotes in the New Yorker. It's a stylistic policy. She could have done what she did here, which is in parentheses, say Raoul Hilberg, or mention the book in the New Yorker. She didn't. We can, again, probably should have. But as for the word appeared, I mean, I think she means published. It didn't come out. I think says appeared. I don't know. Because she knows she knew the book beforehand. And she's here just listing all the different sources she's used in the book, and it's one of them. And she talks about how it's an important source, and numerous times. So, Hilberg was a complicated figure. Obviously, she really didn't like the structure of his book and the arguments of his book, but she found the research in it incredibly useful and powerful. And so she did use it. And again, I don't know the arguments around her and Wallace Shawn and in the New Yorker about why it wasn't mentioned or not. But I know that in the book, as you said, there's a number of mentions of it, and I think she tried to make an effort to give it not only credit, but to explain how it was so useful and the best book on the topic. So that's all I can really say about it. I don't know the other internal discussions that went on for that.
There's two
In any
other
case,
thoughts here. She could have said more in this citation here about her failure to have given him credit in the New Yorker articles, and also when she didn't provide support for the publication. She could have said the book is great except for the first chapter, which I think should be rewritten, rather than rejecting it.
she could have, but that I don't have an issue with. I mean, she didn't think it was she thought the book, I mean, obviously that's what could happen, but she wrote her opinion, which is that the book is not a good book. You could say that Princeton University Press should have gone back and said rewrite the first chapter. That's not her job. Again, Hilberg never publicly accused her of this, and he did it. I don't know enough to say. He went to lawyers. The lawyers didn't think he could win. I don't know. I don't know if there's a case. I don't know enough to say. All I know is that he did have a private beef with her. And she did use some of his work, why it wasn't cited, how it wasn't cited. I don't know enough to say. So I'll leave it at that. Anyway, for those of us interested in the question of conscience, it will be a major topic of discussion in 2 weeks when we read the chapter on the duties of a law-abiding citizen, which we'll read on the 17th. Next week is on the 10th, which is going to be a very historically important chapter of the book on the Wannsee Conference, where the final solution is first agreed upon and adopted by the Nazis. So I look forward to reading those 2 chapters with you the next 2 weeks. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and thank you very much, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Gracias,
Thank
Professor
you.
Roger.
Thank
Merci,
you
à la
all.
prochaine.
Mr. Roger.
Bye.
Ciao, ciao.
Chao,
Bye-bye.
chao. Gracias, gracias.
Ciao.
Ciao.